My folks signed the family business over to my sister's husband. The weight of that sentence settled behind my eyes like a bruise. As I stood there alone under the buzzing fluorescent lights, my hands still coated in machine oil. 10 years of 80-hour work weeks, just gone. Everyone expected me to throw a fit, to yell and scream, to beg and plead. I didn't do any of that. I just washed my hands, hung up my apron, and walked out into the falling snow without saying a single word. They probably figured I'd finally snapped. But then, a week later, when Dad called, practically hysterical, because our biggest client was about to pull out, I just answered him calmly. Let the air handle it. Sometimes silence isn't a sign of weakness. It's the sound of someone taking back everything they rightfully deserve. When I turned 22, my father, Daniel Rowan, handed me a pair of safety glasses and told me, "This is your inheritance, Kelsey. Learn to earn it." That was a decade ago now. Ever since then, I've pretty much lived my life under the harsh glare of those factory lights, with the constant drone of machines older than me buzzing in my ears. I ran the first shift, I ran the night shift, and sometimes I ran both. My fingerprints are probably permanently etched into every single control panel in that whole shop. The building always smelled like a mixture of metal shavings and burnt oil. In the winter, you could see your breath fogging up inside. In the summer, the air shimmered with the heat. And still, I loved it. I honestly thought I was protecting something that my grandfather, Arthur Rowan, had built with his own 2 hands, way back in 1970. A true legacy built on precision, sweat, and a whole lot of pride. He always used to tell me that steel never forgets the hands that shape it. My mother, Margaret, was always a kind woman, but she usually deferred to Dad's judgment. She'd bring lunch sometimes, leave it on the counter for me, and tell me to keep my head down and just focus on your work. Your father only wants what's best for you, she'd say. My older sister, Jenna, was the complete opposite of me. She was more at home in fancy corporate offices and conference calls. She ended up marrying Mason Pierce, a self-proclaimed business strategist who wore shiny dress shoes in a place where the floor never stayed clean for more than 5 minutes. When Mason came on board to modernize operations, my father introduced him as the future of Rowan Metalworks. I just smiled and shook Mason's hand, even though I was still wearing my grease-stained work gloves. His grip was surprisingly soft. At first, it didn't really bother me. I believed in playing the long game. I had faith that my family recognized all the hours I put in, all the burns I'd suffered, all those late-night repairs that nobody else was willing to do. I was convinced that loyalty had a certain weight, a value that just couldn't be ignored. But then, little things started to shift, subtle changes that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. Mason started taking pictures of himself standing next to the machines, posting them online with captions like, "Proud to be leading our talented team into the next era." My father shared every single one of those posts. My mother would comment with heart emojis. But nobody ever tagged me. Then came the brand new company truck for Mason. Spotless, custom detailed, the whole shebang. Dad explained that he needed reliable transportation for all his client visits. Meanwhile, I was still driving that beat-up 20-year-old pickup truck that coughed and sputtered every time I shifted into second gear. One evening, as I was powering down the mills for the night, Mason strolled by in his perfectly pressed shirt, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up, gave me a faint smile, and said, "Don't work too late, Kelsey. Optics are everything, you know." And then he just walked off before I even had a chance to respond. I remember standing there, staring at the red digital readout on the CNC machine, thinking how numbers never lied. They always did exactly what you told them to do. Humans, on the other hand, were a completely different story. By the time the first snow of the year started falling, I'd started keeping track of all the things that weren't being said. The awkward silences at dinner, the missing thank yous, the subtle shifts in power that nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. And somewhere, beneath the constant hum of the machines, I started to hear something else, something breaking. It was around March, when Mason's presence started to feel more permanent, less like a temporary arrangement. His name started showing up in company-wide emails, not just as a marketing consultant anymore, but as the official operations director. I noticed it one morning while I was reviewing blueprints. There were 3 signatures on the approval line: mine, Dad's, and his. That was the first time I felt like the ground was starting to tilt beneath my feet. At meetings, Dad would always turn to him first, before anyone else. "Mason, what's your take on this?" he'd ask. And the same man who couldn't tell a feed rate from a speed rate would clear his throat and confidently say something like, "Efficiency. We need to transition from craft to brand." And everyone would nod in agreement, as if that actually meant something concrete. My mother even started repeating Mason's ridiculous phrases at dinner. "Your father says Mason's bringing vision to the company," she'd say. I asked her, "Vision for what, exactly?" She hesitated for a moment. "Growth, honey. The kind you can't quite see yet." I just forced a smile and went back to cutting my food. And then, of course, there were the photos. Mason absolutely loved being photographed. Every week, he'd post a new picture of himself in the shop, usually standing next to a lathe that I personally maintained, with some generic caption like, "Innovation never sleeps." And my father would share it on his own page, writing, "So proud of our leadership team." One night, I was scrolling through my social media feed, and I just froze. There it was, Mason standing right in front of my workstation, the one that my grandfather had built by hand, with the caption, "Continuing the Rowan Legacy." My stomach just churned, not so much because of the blatant lie, but because of how easily everyone seemed to believe it. A few weeks later, Dad called everyone together for a big strategy meeting. I wiped my hands, which were still warm from working on the mill, and joined the group. Mason had printed out slides filled with bullet points that looked suspiciously like my own notes from the week before. He started explaining his grand plan to restructure the entire production flow, using almost the exact same phrasing that I had written down. Dad nodded approvingly. "That's leadership right there, son," he said. I looked up, thinking I must have misheard him. "Son?" Mason just grinned. "We're all family here, right?" That word, family, just landed like a piece of grit in an open wound. After the meeting, I stayed late, working on recalibrating a machine, just so I could hear something honest for a change. Hank Doyle, the old machinist who'd been working at the shop since Grandpa's day, stopped by my station. His beard always smelled faintly of tobacco and steel dust. He said quietly, "Your granddad used to say that a machine runs best when it's fed by experienced hands. These days, the hands don't seem to touch much anymore." I asked him if he ever regretted staying at the shop all these years. He chuckled softly, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "Never," he said, "because I know exactly what I built here." That line just stuck with me all week long. By summertime, Mason had his own private office. Meanwhile, I was still out there on the factory floor, getting my hands dirty. When I brought up the subject of payroll, after 10 years of reinvesting my share back into the company, Dad said, "Everything's tied up in assets right now, Kelsey. You know that. Don't worry, it'll all be yours one day." That phrase again, one day. Except that one day never actually seemed to arrive. The cracks in the facade had become glaringly obvious by now. Orders were getting delayed, invoices were going unpaid, misfiled paperwork was piling up, and clients were calling me directly to fix all of Mason's oversights. I'd quietly clean up all his messes, hand him the final results, and then just stand there and watch him take all the credit again. The final straw came in late November. Titan Steel Dynamics sent a thank you card addressed to Mr. Pierce for the precision parts that Tide had personally machined. When I showed the card to my father, he just smiled. "Well, that's good PR for the company," he said. I just nodded slowly. "Sure," I said, "for the company." That was the night I finally stopped believing that this was all just one big misunderstanding. The night everything finally broke open was colder than usual. The factory floor was completely empty. The familiar hum of the machines replaced by the faint echo of coolant fluid dripping from the pipes. I was all alone, finishing up the final quality checks on the late order. My hands were covered in black grease when I reached for a binder that had slipped behind one of the drawers. And that's when I saw it. A bright red folder, stamped with the word "Confidential" in big, bold letters. It definitely didn't belong there. I hesitated for a moment. Part of me thought that maybe it was just a client document or some kind of tax record. But something deep down inside already knew what it was. I wiped my hands on a rag, carefully opened the folder, and started reading. Transfers ownership, effective date, 4 months earlier. Signatures, Daniel Rowan and Margaret Rowan. New majority owner, Mason Pierce. My name appeared only once, listed under, quote, employee list. I read it twice, and then a third time, desperately hoping that I was just misreading something. But the ink just glared back at me, sharp and final. 10 years of hard labor. Every hour I'd put in, every scar I'd earned, just erased with one quick stroke of a pen. My throat tightened up, but I couldn't make a sound. I just sank down onto the stool next to the CNC mill and stared at my hands. The same hands that had built, fixed, and fed this place since I was practically still in college. They suddenly looked foreign to me, used and disposable. I thought about my grandfather's voice. Steel remembers the hands that shape it. Apparently, people didn't. When the initial shock finally wore off, a strange sense of calm just washed over me. I carefully slid the papers back into the folder, straightened the stack, and closed the drawer. Then, I stood up, turned off each machine one by one, listening as the noise gradually faded away, leaving only silence behind. Before I left, I wrote one short letter on company stationery. Effective immediately, I resign. Good luck running this place without me. I placed it right on my father's desk, next to his brass nameplate. Then I gathered up the only things that truly belonged to me: my tool notebook, a photo of Grandpa Arthur holding my hand next to the first mill, and his old welding gloves. Outside, the parking lot was covered in a thick layer of frost. My truck coughed and sputtered before the engine finally caught. I looked back through the windshield at the building's glow behind me. The red Rowan Metalworks sign flickered erratically, as if it couldn't decide whether it still worked or not. As I drove off, I didn't cry, I didn't curse, I just whispered one name: Grandpa. For the next week, I stayed in the small apartment above Tori Alvarez's bakery. She didn't pry or ask questions. She just left a fresh cup of coffee and a warm roll on the counter for me every morning. I woke up at 5 o'clock out of habit, stared at my idle hands, and tried to breathe through the deafening silence. On the 8th day, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, until I heard my father's voice, strained and panicked, on the other end of the line. "Kelsey, Titan Steel Dynamics is about to walk away from us. Mason can't fix the order. Please, we need you back." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "Dad," I said softly, "let the air handle it." Dad didn't say anything for a moment. There was just a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing heavily, like he was trying to decide whether to beg or order me to come back. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Kelsey, please! Mason doesn't understand the specs. Titan says the parts are out of tolerance. They're threatening to terminate the entire contract. That's 40% of our revenue." For a split second, muscle memory almost took over. My mind instantly started picturing the mill setup, the tool offsets, the coolant ratios. I knew I could fix it in a matter of hours. I knew I could, but the moment I almost reached for my jacket, I saw that red folder again in my head. The signatures, the betrayal. "I don't work there anymore," I said quietly. "You don't mean that?" His voice broke even higher. "Your family." "No, Dad," I said. "I was labor. You already chose your family." He exhaled sharply, a mixture of pain and anger. "Don't do this, Kelsey." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I stopped doing things for free." And then I hung up the phone. The phone just buzzed and buzzed again for the next hour. But I didn't answer it. I just sat there in the small kitchen, staring at my calloused hands and enjoying the quiet satisfaction of doing absolutely nothing for once. That was the first time silence ever felt truly powerful. Over the next few days, the calls stopped coming, but text messages started trickling in from my old coworkers. Questions, warnings, gossip. Mason's been missing meetings. Titan pulled their inspection team. Your dad looks sick. Tori slid a cup of coffee across the counter one morning and asked, "You just gonna let them drown?" I looked up from the newspaper I was reading. They built the boat, I said. They chose the captain. But I didn't completely walk away from the situation either. I started keeping track of what was happening. Titan Steel filed a formal complaint about receiving defective batches of parts. Vendors started posting notices about delayed payments. Mason had suddenly stopped posting so many photos online. Then one afternoon, I got an email from Nora Park, an old friend from my technical college days who'd gone on to law school. The subject line just said, "Need to talk." When we met at her office in Milwaukee, she looked exactly the same as I remembered her. Sharp, composed, the kind of woman who always walked into a room knowing her next 3 moves. She poured us both some coffee and said, "I heard about the transfer." "You heard right," I replied. She leaned back in her chair, carefully scanning all the printouts I'd brought with me. Copies of the red folder, production reports, client emails, and a whole stack of unpaid tax notices that I'd managed to save before I left the shop. After a while, she finally said, "Kelsey, this isn't just a case of betrayal. It's actually grounds for a legal reversal. Your grandfather had a very specific, documented philosophy. Whoever builds something with their own hands and their heart owns a piece of its soul. That's what's known as founder intent, and the courts take that very seriously. And if we can demonstrate Mason's mismanagement and his misuse of company funds, we'll definitely have a strong case. For the first time in months, I felt something besides anger, clarity. The following weeks just blurred together into a series of long nights spent at Nora's office. We combed through all the records, lining up every invoice and every email like pieces of evidence on a factory floor. I found messages from Titan Steel specifically praising my precision work, thanking me for personally saving critical orders. I found spreadsheets that showed the company's revenue increasing by 180% under my technical oversight, and then crashing dramatically after Mason's arrival. And then, we finally found the proof that we needed the most: Mason's company credit card statements. Thousands of dollars spent on lavish client dinners during Packers games. A $4,800 charge for office equipment that turned out to be a high-end home theater system delivered directly to his house. Nora just looked at me and smiled thinly. "He's a walking audit," she said. We also contacted Hank Doyle, the old machinist. He met us at a local diner, his hands still permanently marked with the grease stains that he could never completely wash off. He brought a folder full of old contracts dating back to Grandpa Arthur's time, all covered in his meticulous handwriting. Words were circled, underlined: team share, joint ownership, collective value. He really meant it, Hank said. "Arthur always said that you were the one who was going to carry this place forward, Kelsey." When I took those papers back to Nora, she just said, "This is gold. This isn't just about fairness anymore. This is about legal intent." She looked up from the files. "Are you ready to face them?" I thought about my father's trembling voice, my mother's silence, Mason's smug grin as he stood next to the machines.